Hello, this is lovely. I've been thinking about a good Harry Potter joke for the last 3 hours, but none really came to me, so I'm just gonna jump right in. How's everybody doing? Yeah? Yeah? You sure? Okay, just checking. Wow, Oxford Union. October 15th, 2017. It will always mark the beginning of a monumental shift in my life, and probably in many of your lives, and certainly around the world. For millions of people, it marked the first time in their lives that they had the space to share some of their deepest, darkest secrets. For hundreds and thousands of people, it was the start of a new and much needed conversation about safety in our workplaces, institutions, and communities. And for a few hundred, it meant a disruption in the harmful, toxic behavior they were engaged in using the various seats of power that they held. Of these groups, the millions of survivors who shared their stories, the hundreds of thousands of employees and others who came forward, and the few hundred who lost power and status, who do we most often hear about? Whose names do we know best? This has been the beginning of the standard talk that I've given for some time now. I travel the world and I talk to rooms large and small, and I ask people to think about it. When it comes to Me Too, or at least the popular discourse around Me Too, who actually gets heard? And what I really mean is, who or what is remembered, and what have we really learned? I've said it before, a lot of time when I hear people discuss Me Too, I'm not exactly sure what movement they're even talking about. That a movement that was created to support survivors and lift up their healing is somehow now a vindictive plot against men or a witch hunt. It's incredible to me. The movement that some people are discussing is unrecognizable, and to those of us who have been doing the work in it for a long time. I mean, look around. More and more celebrity cases of sexual assault emerge every day. It has now become a verb, you can get Me Too'd. And these stories have become a genre of entertainment news. Who did what? Where did it happen? Is the survivor a somebody or a nobody? Are there photos? Was there video? We hem and haw about the fates of the supposedly canceled. Was it fair? Can they return? Are we allowed to listen to their music, read their books, laugh at their jokes, go to their movies? We rate the apologies written by publicists and agents like a sport. Did it contain the right buzzwords? Did they look contrite? Did you really feel it? Did they mention me? Was it written on letterhead, or was it a screenshot from the Notes app on an assistant's phone? And we expect survivors to perform for us too. Can they hit the speaking tour? Are they eloquent or attractive? How many times and to how many people can they restate their trauma for all of us before we move on? And so it goes on and on. What is this exactly? As I stand here in 2020, 14 years after Me Too's work began, and just 2 and some change years after the hashtag went viral, I'm left to wonder, what have we learned about our culture, about each other, about ourselves? To really understand Me Too, this work and the possibilities that it unlocks for each and every single one of us, individually and collectively, we have to truly understand that this work is never about celebrities or court cases or entertainment news. It was never about red carpets and award shows. It was never about counting how much money or fame or influence a wealthy man could lose. It was about the protecting, amplifying, and responding to the collective voices of the people who actually said, Me Too. You have to understand that when we protect the voice, the very notion of a survivor, we fundamentally disrupt something that has been true for the most marginalized among us for thousands of years. For Black women like me and Black folks in our families, for women of every station around the world queer and trans people, for people in the global South, for poor people in great cities of the West, for differently abled people struggling to be seen and fully included in our built environments, for those of us who live at the intersections. And that is the idea that our bodies were never truly ours. You have to understand that this work is sacred. This work is sacred. And it stands on the shoulders of those who have fought for this long before I was even alive. The idea that one has self-determination over what happens with one's body is a most revolutionary act. And so, it makes sense that we would struggle and stumble along the way. After all, many of us have no idea what that might mean. Because, and I've said this before, in order to get there, we have to dramatically shift a culture that propagates the idea that vulnerability is synonymous with permission, and that bodily autonomy is not a basic human right. When we hone in on individual bad actors or depraved, isolated behavior, we fail to recognize that any position of power comes with privilege, and it renders those without that power more vulnerable to harm. Any position of power comes with privilege. We learn these dynamics in relationships that can appear small but end up being monumental in shaping and reflecting our worlds. Teachers and students, coaches and athletes, law enforcement and citizen, parent and child. These are all relationships that can have an incredible imbalance of power. And what we decide is permissible in those relationships informs what we decide is acceptable overall. I've also said that the end result of these lazy headlines and this destructive backlash is kind of a collective trauma. And we know that where social movements activate a sense of possibility, it's trauma that can halt that same possibility in its tracks. It's worth exploring how collective trauma shapes our fundamental understanding of ourselves and our bodies. I find it curious that some people would call Me Too a witch hunt or a lynch mob. Those words in particular. Because in missing the mark completely, it hints at the heart of the matter. My work began with Me Too in 2006 when I was living and working in Selma, Alabama. Selma, for those of you that don't know, was a trading post during slavery and an important arms manufacturing center for the Confederacy during the Civil War. It later became the heart of the civil rights movement, where freedom fighters like John Lewis and Diane Nash and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. planned the Selma to Montgomery marches that would lead to the eventual passage of the Voting Rights Act, prohibiting racial discrimination in voting. The civil rights movement, of course, was fueled by the use of nonviolent civil disobedience, a tactic that shocked the consciousness of people around the world. The willful use of Black bodies facing violence in this way, televised and photographed, was for many people a stirring and unsettling vision. But why? Surely the violation of Black bodies was not a new concept for anyone. But this civil disobedience was an act of self-determination, of training, of readiness. Though these bodies would endure the brunt of this violence, they would no longer accept this violence as routine. The violence would be faced with a resistance that shattered ingrained expectations and peeled the curtain back on American racism. For some, it unlocked shame. For many, it unlocked possibility. The ideas that these bodies considered essential for building the wealth of others, but also rendered worthless by white supremacist edit, could move in unison and in direct contravention of what Black people had been taught was possible. This was the building block of a revolution. You see, what we have been taught was possible was informed by generations of shocking trauma that continues to live in our bones today. But for some of us, that trauma is shaped not only by what is taught, but is also shaped by what is not. not because it isn't true, but because what is often inconveniently true. In the segregated South, the lynching of black men was a pastime. While there was sometimes a form of mob justice, they were nevertheless state-sanctioned events, often attended by law enforcement and elected officials. Lynchings were well-attended Sunday events in many towns. There were even postcards made, much like when people go to the beach or the Caribbean. Hi, Mom, having a great time. Except in this postcard, instead of a beach, a photo of a sea of happy white faces would grace the front. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, gathered to watch the strange fruit hanging from southern trees. Lynching served as a unique, critical, and memorable form of terror of white supremacy in the United States. Whether a result of a sham trial or the rage of a small group of whites, black people in the South lived in fear of a father, uncle, or brother being carted away at any point, and they were often. We are told that more often than not, being found to be having an affair with a black man, a white woman could say she was raped. This would ensure that the man in question would face a lynching. But it's important to remember that in the white imagination, riddled with fear of the notion of sexually superior black men, it was impossible to imagine any kind of consensual engagement between a white woman and a black man. That kind of engagement could, and often did, cost a black man his life. And so while everyone involved could know that two adults decided to have sex, what was allowed to be true was that a Negro had defiled a white woman or her honor. Both parties here are reduced to characters in a play that was meant to keep black folks in their place. The fear was so great that even looking at a white woman could cost a black boy his life. In the case of 14-year-old Emmett Till, he was lynched by a mob after it was said he whistled at or in the vicinity of a white woman, something no black child would have dared to do at that time. And it was in the white supremacist interest, black men were simply disappeared, wholesale. And it was in the white supremacist interest to do so. And so, families were shattered, and black women and children learned to stay quiet. Our bodies were not our own. This is the burden that black women like me and before me have had to carry. We learned to stay quiet because sexual violence was a state-sanctioned weapon. It was wielded against us as a real-world tool of domination by our captors. And again, as an imaginary pretext for violence on our families. A reminder of which bodies mattered in the American imagination. So, the fact that black women faced with sexual violence from within our own communities took a back seat. We were taught that our silence was necessary to protect black men from a prison industrial complex with an enormous appetite for black bodies. This remains an incredible weight for certain survivors to carry. In addition to the usual stigma that comes from speaking up, being considered loose or fast, a liar, or wanting some kind of notoriety. It was from this history that Me Too was born. This is the undergirding of the Me Too movement at its origins. Like in most communities, sexual violence went unaddressed. It wasn't about to end overnight, but in small rooms, slowly and surely, little groups of black girls were learning to say, "Me too." And at the same time, starting a quiet revolution where those who were taught to have the least agency over their own bodies were reclaiming them as their own. Again, the very notion of a survivor is a disruption, because it means that we have to acknowledge that this kind of harm is not only real, but unacceptable, and that the possibility of healing exists on the other side. In doing so, we begin to rewire our thinking about what is possible, who matters, and what is permissible with our own bodies. This is not only important for survivors to see, but everyone else as well. When the coverage of this movement is myopically focused on high-profile cases of depraved behavior, it cements an outsized expectation of what sexual violence looks like. It silences those who know that they've experienced it, but don't feel it meets a specific criteria. This is a double-edged burden that marginalized people are all too familiar with. It means that you stifle your own healing, but that you often do not want your perpetrator to face harm either. It means that if you or anyone else speaks up, you are seen as an enemy. As you'll remember from earlier, Black women are all too familiar with this burden. Recently, this has come up in the news when discussing the death of basketball star Kobe Bryant. For many, he was an incredible athlete who inspired a generation. Some also remembered his sexual assault case. Gayle King, the American journalist, was insulted and attacked for even daring to discuss the facts of the case as a part of a wide-ranging interview about his life and legacy. CBS, the news company that she works for, engaging in the same kind of sensationalism that I just discussed, released a short clip of the interview. They made it seem as if the entire discussion was about this one piece instead of like a boiler room style interrogation. Gayle, in turn, faced death threats and horrific insults that I refuse to repeat from trolls and celebrities alike. To me, this is the casualty of the rampant distortion of the Me Too movement. That ingrained fear of a lynch mob can instead produce hateful acts that obscure truths. We would all do well to remember that that case is real. The survivor is real, and in the end, what she wanted was an acknowledgement of harm and an apology. That's what she thought she needed for her own healing. Seemingly lost in the collective memory is that Kobe Bryant granted that apology. One where he not only acknowledges the harm that speaking up cost the survivor, but where he says clearly in his own words that he apologizes for his behavior on that night. That he says it is clear to him that she did not believe she consented. My calling will always be to focus on survivors, not perpetrators of harm. I'm one woman, and I don't have all the answers. But it bears mentioning that to forget this part of his life means we miss an opportunity to weigh this properly. It is a part of his legacy that might show us a way forward when there is no guidebook. Someone who has committed harm, seen their behavior as unacceptable, and has acknowledged that harm, this too is a possibility model. If Me Too is allowed to become a cultural punchline or a vehicle to speak to the anxieties of the rich and powerful, a soap opera for us to consume, we won't be able to see clearly what we are learning about our culture, ourselves, and each other. And we begin to lose focus on the possibilities of what we can do together. It's about the revolutionary idea that we can determine what happens with our own bodies when we have been told that they do not belong to us. It's about claiming a pathway to healing when you have been told that what you know to be true did not happen, when you have been told to shut up because your truth is inconvenient. It's about the right to say no and finding the joy in saying yes. And fundamentally, it's about understanding that we cannot end sexual violence without dismantling its building blocks, power and privilege. Without that, we will continue to hide behind salacious headlines as the most marginalized communities continue to bear the weight of our collective inaction. And although I'm tired, and I know many of you are also tired, I am committed because I'm standing on the shoulders of those who have used their bodily autonomy to fight for freedom, like the civil rights heroes of Selma, like the queer and trans warriors of Stonewall, like the brave young people who took to the streets to declare to the world that Black lives matter. They too were propelled by the collective power of possibility. And at the end of the day, I'm only standing here speaking to you because at some point, somewhere back far before I was born, in a cotton field, my ancestors sketched out a vision of a world where I was possible. And so is the world we are building together. Thank you. That was very generous of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it is.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming here today and for that incredible address. We're all so honored to have you here.
Thank you.
I wanted to start by going to the very beginning of your work as an activist, which began when you were a teenager. How did you first start getting involved in working to improve the lives of young girls in marginalized communities? And can you tell us a bit more about this work?
Sure. I mean, my work didn't start off with young girls at all. I was a young girl myself. I was 14, 15 years old. And coming from a very conscious family, I was raised by grandparents and parents that were, incredibly invested in my cultural knowledge and historical knowledge, and making sure that I was grounded in both the history of Black people in America and the world. And so I grew up with a sense of very early what injustice looked like, but I didn't have tools to do anything about it. You know, I could read all the books and I could get angry at the headlines that were happening, but I didn't know how to be a part of it until I joined a youth organization called 21st Century Youth Leadership Movement. And it was founded by veterans of the civil rights and Black Power and labor and the various movements of the 60s and 70s. Those elders from that movement wanted to make sure their legacy of work continued. And so they recruited young people from all over the country to go through this ongoing and intensive leadership development training to be grassroots community organizers. And so I became that really early. It was the perfect marriage of this fire I had burning in me to do something. And also I think people forget that the 80s and 90s in America in particular, and definitely in New York, there was a very similar time period to the teens, the late aughts and early teens in America. You know, there was Trayvon Martin's murder launched people into being politically active around the country. We had a similar young man named Yusef Hawkins who was murdered in New York. That case helped politicize me, along with cases like the Central Park Five, and so I was really anxious to get involved in community work and political work. My lens at the time, though, was very much focused on race and economics, and economic injustice, racial injustice. And so I didn't have a lens around sexual violence, around gender-based violence, around even, feminist politics, because nobody taught them to us, which was was left over from with how they had come up. There was so much sexism in the various movements that laid the groundwork for some of the work that we do now, and a lot of that was passed on. So that's where I was early on.
And then in 2006, you originated the phrase Me Too.
Oh girl, you done jumped about 20 years, but okay.
Well, I was gonna ask about the transition from your work as a young activist to starting this incredible international movement.
I'm gonna tell you a story. When I was in college, I was a really, involved activist on my college campus. And one time there was a news story printed in the paper about this protest we did on campus, this huge protest that I led on campus. And I was very proud of myself. And so I sent the clipping to one of my elders who had trained me in this work, and I said, oh look, I'm in the news. And she said, why they call you a student activist, a student organizer? And I said, I don't know, because I'm a student. And I was very confused. And she said, this is a playground. Your college campus or what you're doing there is a microcosm of the rest of the world. Organizing is in your blood. If you're just a student organizer, what happens when you graduate college? Are you finished when you leave that campus? And I was like, gosh, she's so serious. But, but it made me realize that the work is the work is the work. And so there was no real transition. I left school knowing and I feel very honored and really fortunate to have known what I wanted to do with my life very early on. So I left school and continued that work. I'll say if there was some sort of realization, I went to work for 21st Century, the organization that sort of raised me in this work. And, I was a survivor. I was a survivor of child sexual abuse and had been carrying that and not knowing what to do with it, right? There were no outlets for it. There were no people who recognized behavior in my school and said, you should go to a counselor. There was just no place to rest that thing. So I held it like most people and I just tucked it away. And I think I poured myself into the movement work because it made me feel useful and good. And so at the point when I started working with other young people, I was consistently encountering young girls like myself who were also survivors of child sexual abuse or some kind of sexual violence. And it became, this is a very abbreviated version of it, but it became really difficult to ignore. And I had to figure out my politics around that on my own because there were no mentors or elders that I knew that I had access to talk to about it. These were the same adult women who were saying, be quiet, who would go out and, tear down the streets around any number of issues. But when it came to this, they were like, let's talk about it in private. Let's have small sessions about it. And so, over time, as I met more and more young girls who had that experience, it really began for me as a way of, this is that same thing I'm saying and it's built into my DNA about recognizing injustice. It's just that I started to realize that this was an injustice. It's an injustice that these children have to walk around holding this burden on their own, feeling isolated and ostracized in their own communities, in their families, and feeling like they are alone to carry this burden. That's an injustice. And I started recognizing that if we are going to fight these larger injustices in the world, it is equally unjust to ask people to put aside that trauma to join these fights without any means of healing or dealing with that trauma. The adults around me and the elders who trained me used to always say things like, the first rule of organizing is you take people from where they are. You meet people's needs. You take them from where they are, but you meet people's basic needs. And every time we would be in those trainings, it would be food, clothing, and shelter, right? Those are people's basic needs. But I had other needs. I had other basic needs. I needed healing. I needed somebody to tell me that I wasn't crazy, or that I wasn't bad, or that I wasn't dirty. I needed to feel valuable. I needed to feel worthy, right? That's a basic need, like we need to breathe. And so, yeah, I had food, clothing, and shelter all the time, but I was eating that food and wearing these clothes and living in these places feeling empty and having to use these other things and pour them inside of myself like this activism, like that was gonna change something. And so it became clear to me that I needed to do something that was toward this end in order to really feel valuable and also to interrupt what I knew was coming for these girls. Because I had lived it. I was only 6-7 years ahead, older than them, really. So I knew what was coming. And so with a very, very small group of like-minded other young women, I started doing this work. And there was a time when I realized that this is what my movement work would look like. Not that I would not still fight against police brutality and racial injustice, all of these other different things, but my central focus would be around Black women and girls and their bodily autonomy and their worthiness.
You mentioned that you were lucky enough to always know what you wanted to do with your life. Have there been any moments where you felt disillusioned with your work?
All the time.
And how do you get through that and keep going?
I just think that there is this way that we make people into superheroes who do any kind of work that is not like, it's like if you're in corporate America, you're evil. If you're in the movement work, you're a hero. And it's just more complicated than that. And this idea that we don't get tired or worn out, or when we do, we push through. No, don't push through. I actually don't want to work with people who are pushing through their tiredness and pushing through their burnt outness. Be burnt out. Be tired. When I got tired, I did something else. I worked in arts and culture for years because this work is, not only is it's not meant to be rewarding in a way that lots of people would think, but it's hard. It's particularly hard when you are also carrying your own trauma. And so at some point I had to find a different means, a different way. And so I switched up to I still did this work sort of out of my back pocket. I've always done it consistently at every job that I've had, but I kind of switched gears for a little while. And I don't feel bad about it. I did at the time, don't get me wrong. I had to evolve to this understanding, but I remember feeling like I would see little girls on the street, young girls, and think, oh, I should go back, or I should do this and I should do that. I would always feel this guilt. But the author Toni Morrison, and as a matter of fact, in my arts and culture work, I had an opportunity to spend a day with her. And we had a private interview with her. And my daughter, who was, I don't know, maybe 13 or 14 at the time, asked her, what do you do when you have writer's block? My daughter was aspiring writer, whatever. What do you do when you have writer's block? And she said, if you're blocked, it's because you're supposed to be blocked. And she said, I don't believe in writer's block. I believe that there comes a time when you have a pause. And so if that comes up in your work, respect the pause. That changed something for me. I think that when you're tired, you have to stop and nourish your body. I would rather people take time away to be well, because here's another part about this that, especially in this work, most of us who come to the work because we are the work, right? This sister named Joanne Smith, who I used to work with in New York, says that all the time. We come to the work because we are the work. And so if you are a survivor, already carrying your own trauma, and you've decided to dedicate your life to this work, there's going to come a time when it's too much. That's just a reality. But what we don't recognize is that our own healing is a part of the work. Ultimately, we want people in the world who feel whole again, who have a pathway to come back to themselves, whatever that self is. So if you have to pull out from the work to take care of yourself and your wellness, your mental health, your whatever it is, you're not stopping the work, you're doing it differently. And so I don't feel guilty about needing to take a break. I don't feel guilty about taking a step back. I absolutely get tired and disillusioned. I mean, come on, I live in America, right? We have a situation in case y'all got a situation too. I don't want to act like y'all don't have a situation, but but it's difficult not to be tired,
And then going to the start of the Me Too movement, do you remember, well, I'm sure you do, but when was the first time that you said the phrase Me Too? Where did that come from?
I do remember. I was, you're gonna have to read my book for some of this. But I was going through a very hard time trying to figure out my own stuff, a very hard time. I was, again, I had met these group of women at this random function I went to in California who taught me the word survivor. At the time, I wasn't even acclimated to saying victim. I just didn't talk about it. It's a thing that happened that lived inside of me and in my head, and I talked to myself about it, but very, very few times did I talk to people outside in the world about it. And these women casually, in a casual setting, started talking about being survivors of sexual violence. And I thought I was being brave by saying, as a victim, something. They all said, no, you are not a victim. You are a survivor. And it was one of those, moments that sort of reset the trajectory of my life, because it felt so good, just the feeling, the saying the words, the thinking about it. It felt so good to think about having overcome something as opposed to having succumbed to something. And so it shifted my thinking, and I had already been sort of squirreling away ideas about how do I address this issue? How do I take this back to my community? At the time, I had co-founded this organization, Just Be, and we were doing all this great work with young girls in Selma, but I know I wanted to ramp it up. And so I didn't have a name for the work, for anything yet. We were just doing these little workshops. And really after a particularly tumultuous night of like, my demons would just pop up. You know, we know that people who are survivors know that you can't control when that thing comes on you. You can't control when the memory comes back, you know, a smell, a feeling, a touch, anything can just bring those things back. And you know, it happens less and less as you go on in life, but at this point, something had triggered a very, very difficult episode for me. And I think it was because I was wrestling with, you know, where do I go next with this work that I have been doing, this healing work, and how do I marry it to this? I don't know, just I'm a Virgo. We overthink. And so I had just been overthinking, and I fell asleep in that state, and I woke up, and this often happens. I you know, my life is a little bit dramatic sometimes, but I woke up, and these things came to me, not just the name, but I wrote Me Too at the top of the page of this little steno notebook. And then I just wrote out this plan I had. I'm like, this is what I want to do. But because it, just like that, this clarity came about what organizing around sexual violence could look like. And so I remember I emailed my friend who was in New York, and there was a thing back in, they might still have it, but you know, this was new. You could create your own t-shirts online. You can go online and like, there was this little website. And so it's just how people now, when you get an idea, they go to GoDaddy and they running by the domain name, right? Y'all do that, don't you? It's just me? Oh, okay. Well, I wanted to like make a t-shirt, like see what it would look like on a t-shirt. And so I made the t-shirt, and then I took the picture and I emailed it to my friend, and I said, what if we, because I've been struggling with a name, I said, what if we called it Me Too? And she wrote me back and was like, oh man, that's so good, you know? And that was it. We started calling the work that we were doing around sexual violence, like pulled it out of the leadership work. And I developed this workshop. We created a MySpace page, and it just kind of took off from there.
And you mentioned this a bit in your speech, but do you feel to any extent that the movement has been appropriated by Hollywood, and the light that has been cast on a few celebrity cases, has that cast an even larger shadow on the voices of minority groups that need to also be heard?
Well, I don't use minority, but I think that what has happened is that the media has co-opted it. I think Hollywood is still trying to figure out how they can respond to what happened in Hollywood. And they're working through that, and they have Time's Up, and they're doing all kinds of different projects and things like that that are great, that are specific to what happened in Hollywood. So Hollywood didn't co-opt it. The media decided to focus on Hollywood. And because, we like shiny things. And so you had, wealthy, privileged, beautiful white women coming forward to say that these things had happened to them. And they paid more attention to that, of course, than to anything else. I don't blame those white women for that. I blame the media. And I blame our socialization in America. We are trained to respond to the vulnerability of white women. And so if you have white women coming forward and saying, oh my God, this happened to me, everybody's gonna say, well, we gotta do something about that. We can't possibly have them feeling, looking, thinking this thing, right? We have to respond to that. But over time, they even stopped responding to the white women. If you think about it, we stopped hearing about the women in Hollywood after a while. And we only heard about these powerful men whose lives had been disrupted. After you had the Weinstein accusers and the women in Hollywood came forward, there are very few articles about what happened to the material lives of the people who came forward and said Me Too first, right? What happened to, or said that this thing happened to them first. And so it shows you the interest is really in the salaciousness. They don't care about those women. They don't care about those. They care about them as much as they can sell their paper or get clicks and that kind of thing. There's far more hand-wringing and worrying and questioning about what's going to happen now. Can Louis C.K. come back? What happens to the Me Too movement if Weinstein is acquitted? These are the questions that are being asked. And also, I don't measure the Me Too movement by what you see in the media. It's not a movement. The viral hashtag gave us a moment that propelled this movement into the mainstream. The movement is what happens on the ground. The movement is what happens in the lives of the people who had the courage to sit up in front of their computers and say, "Me too," right? Those are the people I'm most concerned about. And it's true, if we don't do something to shift the narrative around Hollywood and the perpetrators and things like that, not only will we miss an opportunity, right? Because who knows how long people will really want to think about and talk about this thing. We've never had this moment before. But it will go down in history as such a failing. We had such an opportunity to do something to actually shift culture. Culture hasn't shifted yet. It would be such a failing for this to be remembered as a verb, you know. And I know that the work that we are doing in our organization and as a movement is about making sure that doesn't happen.
So what can we do beyond just the hashtag to make real change and to change the culture?
Well, there's tons of things you can do, right? Like here's the part that I think the reason why I keep focusing on movement when I talk about, when I have these talks, is that I think folks don't realize how movement works. Movements don't work unless people are engaged in them. And again, I am just one person. I'm one person with one vision. My vision involves ensuring that people who have experienced sexual violence have a space to heal and are moved to action. And the people who want to do something about sexual violence, be it survivor or ally, are moved to action. Action can look like your own behavior changing. Action can be small groups of people taking it among themselves in your school, right? This school is a community. If you know that you are in a community, and for most people, this is undergrads, it's like you're the first time that you've had a community where you have a voice, you have power. And so things that you can do is make sure that you have protection and you have safety on your campus, in your community. That's absolutely something you can do. Because what people do in the communities surrounding colleges and universities is they learn from them. So maybe your college and university can model what safety and protection could look like for the community outside of the walls of Oxford. You know, you can look at your personal behavior. We talk about bystander intervention all the time. And so, you know, I run into young men who, and I like to be really clear that the Me Too movement is not a woman's movement. It's a survivors movement. That means all survivors, however they identify. And so I don't like to engage men first and foremost as perpetrators, right, without acknowledging that they too can be survivors of sexual violence. But I meet young men all the time who say, you know, I love what you're doing, I think Me Too is great. I'm not that guy. I would never rape a woman, touch a woman without her permission, blah, blah, blah. And I say, congratulations, human being. That's how humans are supposed to interact. However, I want to know what you do when you see your buddy doing it. I want to know how many jokes you laugh at that are inappropriate. I want to know how many times you were silent when there was a rape joke being tossed around. And it's not just the guys, right? I talk to young women, especially on college campuses. How many times have you called a girl a slut without knowing any information about her, except what somebody else said? All of that contributes to rape culture. And the reason why we have to dismantle rape culture is because it creates the space for the violence to happen, right? And so people who want to know what they can do as individuals, there are lots of things you can do in your own day-to-day life to dismantle rape culture, which helps us to move further and further away from the violence. I mean, you can also go volunteer at a local rape crisis center, you could get bystander intervention training, you could look at the policies at your school and make sure that they are sound, and if they're not, do something about it, right? Look for the gaps. The thing about this moment and why it's so important and why those of us who have been in this work are looking around like, thanks for joining us, because people are like, oh my God, look at all the sexual violence in the world, I can't believe this is happening. And we're like, no, since the beginning of time, literally, right? But part of the reason why is because people are not trained to even acknowledge sexual violence and its existence. We just dismiss it and we look over it in these various situations that arise. It becomes the smallest thing, the smallest part of it. And so we have to think about your lived experience, whether it's on this college campus, in your community at home, in your family, in a sports group. Think about what your lived experience is in that place. And if you are a survivor already, or if you know somebody who has survived something, what didn't they have? What could have they used when it happened to make their lives easier? what could have been in place before it happened to make sure it didn't happen. These are the gaps that exist in our day-to-day lives that we don't think about. I talk to women sometimes in corporate environments and ask them, do you know, or people, not even just the women, do you know what the sexual harassment policy is in your job? Most people know it exists because it has to, right? It's part of the law, but they haven't read it. If you read it and you're like, oh my gosh, this doesn't even cover A, B, C, or D, you know? So there's tons of ways that folks can get involved. The bottom line is to get involved, to know that everybody has a contribution to make. You don't have to be on the front lines. You don't have to give up your life and become an activist dedicated to the Me Too movement. You can be a part of the movement in very big ways, but also in very small ways. We call them micro actions.
And going back to the dismissal of talking about sexual violence that you mentioned earlier, what sort of backlash did you get, if any, when you first started to open up the discussion on the movement?
Well, we got tons of backlash because people are uncomfortable with it. Even the people who, I could survey 100 people and they'll say, oh God, I absolutely support the movement. I think it's terrible what happens to people, and I think sexual violence is terrible. And then I ask those people to take a next step and say, join us or do this thing. And they're like, well, no, I don't want to actually talk about it. I'm just saying, it's bad. People, even the most well-intentioned people, don't feel uncomfortable having those kind of conversations. And people sometimes get, you sit in that discomfort and it renders them inactive. Or I think some folks, we get this backlash from that, and it's because of when you're starting to disrupt these systems, when you're even talking about, we haven't disrupted the systems, right? We're just talking about strategy for disrupting them. We're just throwing, it's like David and Goliath, right? Throwing rocks at this enormous thing. We haven't cracked it yet. But even that little bit of discomfort is so enraging to people. They don't want to change the status quo. Well, now, oh gosh, now I have to what? Like ask permission when I want to have sex? What's that about? I'm like, you weren't doing that already? I just think that until people recognize that this change that everybody says they want to happen can't happen until we are comfortable with our discomfort, until we are mentally prepared that this is going to change some things that we have been sort of just okay with for a long time, we won't have the space to do the kind of work that we need to do. So, the kind of backlash we got were people saying, don't do that now. That's important, but, we, particularly in the movement circles that I was in, it was way more important to deal with the big, thing that was happening. I think about our response to gun violence versus our response to sexual violence all the time. In our communities, in America, obviously, we have a huge problem around guns and access to guns and firearms and things of that nature. And when a person, particularly a child, is gunned down in the street, we have an immediate visceral reaction to that. People in the community come out to support the parents. People make statements to the press and they say, this is an outrage. We cannot have children being shot in the street. People who are not connected to the child or the family will say, I want to sign up. What can I do? I want to volunteer to do something to make my community safer. We have campaigns that erupt and say, we have to get these guns out of the hands of children or get them off the streets. And everybody understands that. Everybody understands that their safety is connected to that in that community, even if they're not connected to that particular child. But what happens when a child is molested in a community? What happens when a person is sexually assaulted in a community? People don't feel the same connection to that violence. There's an opposite reaction of, be quiet. We can't talk about this. It's going to disrupt too many things. Let's quietly pull back and talk about this over here. But we don't want everybody to know because this thing might happen or that thing might happen. There's not an uprising, right? And if there is, it's a small group of the same people who nobody wants to hear from. And so they have a moment, and then that moment is gone. And so what we have to do is get people to raise the level of consciousness around sexual violence to where it is around other social justice things that we can see automatically, that we know automatically this is wrong. And not just wrong, because most people will say it's wrong, but I am connected to doing something about it. That's going to be the shift that we need, right? Even in the face of backlash, even in the face of people who are always going to be naysayers. I recognize that this is fundamentally wrong and that my community can't thrive without it, and that if one person, right, if we know that if one person is killed in our community, that nobody is safe. If one person's body is violated in our community, none of us is safe. And not just safe from unsafe from like it happening to us, but do you want to live in a community where somebody's body, where you can't have bodily autonomy, where you don't have the right to say what does and doesn't happen with your own body? We should not want to live in those communities. We should be organizing and having community action around making sure that that doesn't happen. That's the work of the Me Too movement. I don't care about the headlines, because whatever happens in the headline is going to be gone tomorrow when this happens. And the outcome of these individual things that happen in the headlines don't change what happens on the ground in my community. They don't matter in the long run to what happens in our communities. And so we have to take our eyes off of those things and put our eyes on what really matters.
Thank you. On that note, we have time for a few audience questions. Could we start with the member at the end of the second row here?
Hi, thank you so much. My name's Chelsea Jackson. I'm from Decatur, Georgia.
Sorry, just to jump
here.
in, could you stand up just
okay.
Recorded? Thank you.
Come on, Decatur.
Yes, my name's Chelsea Jackson. I'm a Rhodes Scholar studying here at Oxford graduate degree. My question is about recognition. Mm-hmm. In finding about Me Too and through the viral movement, and then months and months and months later, having one of my comrades tell me, hey, you know this like woke black woman came up with that, and like she's in Alabama and she's doing all this cool stuff. I wanted to ask you about your journey with that and how you've dealt with, I can imagine how many times you've been questioned about that idea, that origin story that you just told us. If you could just kind of talk about that, because in the fight with feminism and sexual violence, so often black women and other intersectional women, we're so easily erased and our work is just stripped from us and everybody uses it, but then you're lost. And to see you standing next to your work just makes me so proud. So if you could talk about that.
Sure. I get this question a lot, and I definitely get it from black women a lot. The thing I struggle with is, I obviously never did this for recognition. This is not the path to fame, right? Not the normal path. And so when Me Too first went viral, I was so struck mostly by the fact that people cared to talk about sexual violence, but my role in it became this feverish fight to kind of save the work, to make sure that it didn't get, not just like I was separated from, but that people didn't think it originated in Hollywood or around these kind of things. That was important because there are too many little black girls who have gone through our little Me Too program or our Just Be program, or women who have, gone through this work and worn this T-shirt to have that just be erased. I was very, very afraid of that. I think that I had a moment where, kind of a come to Jesus moment. You from Decatur, you know what I mean. So where I realized that sometimes, and again, the work I have been doing in Me Too expanded beyond our original group, right? I worked with all survivors over the 10 or 12 years from the time we started to the time it went viral. But at the core was always black women and girls. And I just had this sort of moment where I realized that what God was doing in this moment was expanding my territory and saying that you have this vision that can still be centered around black women and girls, but is now a gift for the world. And so when I shifted my thinking around it, like, there's nothing about me that says I can't also keep my eye on the prize. And I know that, and the prize being us. And I know that by doing that, I will serve everybody. I'm really clear that keeping black women and girls at the center of this makes it more possible that everybody gets what they need. And so I think that shift helped me. I will never be as famous as recognized as blah, blah, blah as. I don't know that that's necessary. What is necessary is that while I have this moment, because we only get a little bit of time, that while I have this moment, that I do my best to keep focused, to keep the conversation where it should be, to keep saying, you know, I probably say the word survivor 1,500 times a week, you know, but I'm okay with that, because when I say that, I also get to say queer and trans and black and brown and disabled, indigenous. I get to say all of those things at the same time. And I'm proud of that. And so I think the space that I've been allowed and the space that I've not been allowed and decided to take up is way more than I could have ever imagined I'd have available to me doing the work in the way that I was doing it. So I'm both grateful for that and cognizant of what else is necessary. You're welcome.
Thank you. Could we go to the member over there? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you a question on the educational side of things.
Mm-hmm.
You've hinted at, you've told us about the problem. You've hinted at the kinds of, you know, I was wondering whether you think there's a certain way to educate for the kind of human values that you were speaking about earlier. Because one thing that comes to my mind is and I'm wondering whether you've thought about this, is that there's Leslie Udwin, who's produced a movie, India's Daughter, which looked at a rape case in 2012, and then she went and did like a educational project as a consequence of it to try to address those issues. So I'm wondering whether you've thought about those kinds of questions and what, you know, society could be doing on that front.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, a part of our work is education. People don't even, the kind of education that's necessary that I'm really clear about, folks don't even know, they don't know the breadth and depth of sexual violence across the world, I think, right? So many folks have just said, I just didn't know, I didn't understand, blah, 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 blah. So there's that. And I think the sheer number of people, right, there were 19 million tweets or something like that in the first year, and we're going into year 3. The sheer number, nobody can ignore the empirical data that's out there now, right? And so it's hard for people to say they don't see the largeness of the problem. The kind of education I see now is twofold. One, I think there's education around, you know, comprehensive sex education, essentially, in schools that is focused year after year after year, adding on, commensurate with the young person's, you know, age and ability, information about sex and gender and sexuality and sexual violence and boundaries and consent. That has to be in our curriculums for students from very young, and that's something that we advocate for. I do think also, to your point about this movie, that narrative intervention is very important. And one of the biggest ways and easiest ways to disseminate information to people is through the media and through documentary and media programs, which is another thing that we are absolutely working on. But there's another part of education that I think needs to happen, and it can happen through those vehicles. People need to be educated on what it is to survive. What does survival look like? What does it feel like? What does it cost? Right? There's a human cost, there's a financial cost, there's an emotional cost, and because people don't understand that, some of the folks who have to make decisions about our lives are just uninformed. People who vote, people on juries who just have these really small understanding of the life cycle of a survivor. That needs to change so that they understand how we move in the world, and we all move very differently. And I think that's a part of our work too. So education is certainly at the center of how we plan to build and grow the movement. It's too important because there's so much missing information. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have time for one final question.
Oh, somebody way in the back.
Could we go to the member in the very black and the blue? Could you stand up? Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, my question is very simple. Do you call yourself a feminist?
I can't hear.
Do you call yourself a feminist?
I'm a black feminist, absolutely. I call myself a black feminist if that means something to you.
We can have one more question. Could we go to the member on the end of the row in the middle, in the orange or red? I can't, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. So you called your work sacred earlier, which I thought was a really interesting word to use. Do you think it's possible to restore a positive culture around sex without understanding sex itself to be sacred?
Do I think it's, say it one more time. Do I think
Sure.
it's possible?
Yeah, do you think it's possible to restore a positive culture around sex without understanding sex itself to be sacred?
I mean, I think that everybody doesn't think sex is sacred, and I'm not sure that they have to necessarily, but it would be wonderful if we could value our emotional and our intimate interactions in a different way than we do now. I think that it would be helpful for people to see our human interactions as sacred, as the way that we hold each other. I don't mean physically, but the way that we hold space for each other and the way that we interact with each other. All of those things should be seen as sacred, and I think those are the conversations around boundaries and respect and compassion and humanity that we need to have more often, so that more than just the act of sex is sacred, but our human interactions and the way that we are involved with each other should be sacred. We should think of it in a very different way than we do now, where people can be just tossed away, or you can be disrespectful or cross boundaries with them. If we value our humanity as sacred, I think that would be helpful in all of those interactions. Yeah, that's my political answer.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today, but please join me in thanking Tarana for coming to the meeting.